Now that PMDG has released their 737 series of aircraft for Xbox, I think it's a perfect opportunity to present a tutorial on how to get this aircraft from a cold and dark state to engines running, all ready to go for a prototypical flight. This is certainly a complex aircraft, and that being so, the process of getting things up and running may seem daunting at first if you're unfamiliar with the PMDG product line or the 737 in general. However, in this video, we'll be going through the process in a manner that I believe is as straightforward as possible, while retaining enough detail for a semi-prototypical approach to how someone who is well versed in this aircraft would perform their initial flight procedures. Although I'll be doing this on a PC, the procedures I'll be performing should be directly applicable to both the PC and Xbox platforms. I'll be assuming that you have a few things at your disposal before we begin this tutorial. First, you have a flight plan handy. This will ensure that you have all the appropriate information necessary when it comes time to program the Flight Management Computer System, or FMC. If you're unsure where to access a flight plan, I encourage you to go to simbrief.com, an excellent and free resource for easy flight planning. However, for this tutorial, I'll be using one I've made myself, and all the appropriate information from it will be provided for you in the video description, so I encourage you to follow along. The second thing to have handy, although not technically required, are charts. These will help you not only for informational purposes, but for situational awareness as well, and are indispensable for performing any flight, regardless of the aircraft. I use Navigraph, and I encourage you to research their services for yourself to decide whether the investment required is right for you. Now a quick disclaimer. I'm not a pilot. I don't pretend to be one either. I've spent a few thousand hours in flight simulation and have a few hundred hours under my belt with this aircraft, and I'll be showing you how I typically perform things. I'll be foregoing any checklists associated with procedures to be carried out during the cold and dark phase of this flight, so that the process will be as streamlined as possible. If I end up doing anything incorrectly, know that it's most likely due to this, and it will not affect the outcome in any significant manner. This is, after all, merely a simulation. Now that all that's out of the way, let's get into the flight deck and begin. Welcome to the flight deck of the 737-800. Today we are Qantas Flight 102 departing Nadi International Airport in Fiji, bound for Kingsford Smith International Airport in Sydney, Australia. We begin our process by heading to the overhead panel of the aircraft and turning the battery switch to the on position. This provides us with auxiliary power to the aircraft, but does not give power to all the aircraft systems. Therefore, we also pull the ground power switch to the on position. We also arm the emergency exit lights, flip the position lights, our nav lights, to steady, as well as flip the left and right side window heat switches to on. Although we are in a warm climate, and the window heats are not needed while on stand, it's good practice to have them on lest we forget and find ourselves at high altitudes with our windshield fogging up or freezing over. Next, we look higher on the overhead panel and turn our left and right IRS switches over to nav to begin the alignment process. Here I also like to turn the display selector knob to heading STS. This gives us an indication in minutes until the system is fully aligned. Next, we head to the pressurization panel and select our final cruising altitude, found in our flight plan, and our landing altitude, found on our chart for Sydney. I like to make sure that the landing altitude selection is one turn above the actual field elevation, although this minor quirk is ultimately of little importance. For now, that's all we need to do for the overhead panel, although we'll be coming back to it shortly. Now we go to the FMC, or Flight Management Computer. This is probably the most daunting aspect for those who are new to this aircraft. But it's actually quite a bit simpler than it first appears. Do note, however, that there is a very high level of complexity available for one should they have the knowledge and skills required to utilize everything this little box has to offer. Also, ample settings and options are available for the aircraft, which can be found by clicking the PMDG Setup soft key. I encourage you to explore these options to become familiar with all the various settings that can be altered to your liking, since I won't be going through them here in this video. The first thing I'm going to do here is to go into the FS Actions menu and set our fuel and payload for today's flight. Again, these are found in our flight plan and are critical for all the various performance calculations required throughout all phases of our flight. I do this here for the sake of the tutorial, in order to simplify the fueling and loading procedures so that we ultimately have fewer reasons to hop around the FMC. But PMDG does provide a number of alternative ways in which the fueling and loading of the aircraft can be done dynamically in real time. Next, we return to the menu and go into the FMC option. Click next to Pause Init and enter our airport, November Foxtrot, Foxtrot November, under Ref Airport. We now click Next Page and select the information from the GPSL line, which copies it into our scratch pad. Click Previous Page and select Set IRS Position to fill in this line. Next, we click Route. Note that our scratch pad is pre-filled with our current airport code. We select Origin to paste this information in. Now we type in our destination airport, Yankee Sierra Sierra Yankee, and select Dest. Here we also fill in our flight number, Quebec Foxtrot Alpha 102. Enter it, and then click Next Page. Now we're presented with our route page. This is where we'll enter all of the waypoints and airways for our flight besides the SID and STAR, which we'll get to in a moment. Waypoints are entered into the right side column labeled To, while airways are entered into the left side column labeled Via. We can disregard the DCTs in our routing, as these simply indicate a direct to instruction, which you'll see is filled in automatically as direct. For what it's worth, I find an easy way to distinguish between airways, waypoints, VORs, SIDs, and STARs by the following. All waypoints will be 5 letters resembling a word, while VORs will be 3 letters, generally as a kind of acronym for the name of the VOR itself, and should be different than DCT. Airways will normally have a number in them, along with a single letter, or a few letters, and the SID and STAR will always be the first and last ones listed respectively on your flight plan. Once we've filled in our main routing appropriately, we can select Activate and then click the Execute button. Now we can go into the Departures and Arrival page and select DEP on the top left side. We're departing runway 20 via the Foxtrot departure. So we select both of these and again click Execute. After clicking Index, we now select the right side ARR soft key on the Sydney line. Selecting the arrival runway first, we're planning for the ILS runway 25 approach and the MARLN 5 arrival. Once both are selected, again we click Execute, and now we can head to our legs page in order to check for any discontinuities or possible duplications in our flight plan. This is also where I like to put my navigational display, or ND, into the plan mode, so that I can step through each point in the route as an extra verification step to ensure that all the information I entered is correct. To step through a flight plan, use the bottom left knob on the EFIS control panel and select the plan position. Simply click Step on the FMC until each waypoint has been gone through. It's an important step, as depending on the complexity of the routing, there may be a chance that we made a mistake somewhere when entering it, and it's best to catch it now and correct it than find out too late and try and scramble to do it then. Once done, turn the knob back to the map position. Now is as good a time as any to return to the overhead panel and get things ready for pushback and startup. We imagine that passenger boarding has begun, and since the fuel has been loaded, we can flip the fasten seatbelt switch to on. Also, we need to start up the APU in order to get air flowing back into the passenger cabin. as well as for providing air bleed pressure for engine start. To start the APU, simply flip the APU switch to start. Note that it may take a minute or more for the APU to start and become available. While we're waiting for that, we can flip the yaw damper switch to on and the middle electric hydraulic pump switches to on. Now we can see that the middle gen off bus light is illuminated on the bus transfer panel. This tells us the APU is ready to be put on the bus, and we simply pull the APU gen switches down. We can now go and turn the left and right pack switches to auto, as well as set the APU bleed switch to on. Now that the APU is on and running, we can disconnect the ground power unit, or GPU. We do that by going into the FS Actions menu, Ground Services, and selecting Release under the ground power option. Note, do not do this until you have the APU on the bus, otherwise you'll lose power to your aircraft. It's also a good idea to set your transponder code at this point. Even if I'm not flying online, I still make a habit to set it to 2000. Now it's time to finish up the FMC. We select Perf Init and are presented with the page where we can now enter various information from our flight plan. Note that you can double-click the zero fuel weight button and the aircraft will automatically detect that for you. Also, pay special attention to the transition altitude. My setup defaults to 18,000, but this particular departure calls for flight level 110, or 11,000. Once all the fields have been filled out, hit execute, and then N1 limit. Now this is where things get a bit subjective. Since we're lacking any kind of performance calculator, we have to be cognizant of the D-rate selection we make here. What kind of performance one can get away with is a matter of experience, and relies on taking certain key things into consideration. Field elevation, runway length, runway condition, outside air temperature, wind speed and direction, precipitation, current altimeter, aircraft weight, as well as many other factors all go into making the decision of how much to derate your engines for takeoff. Since we don't have that calculation available to us, we judge that since runway 20 is 10,000 feet long, it should be sufficient for us to at least do a 24K derate in these weather conditions. However, it's ultimately up to you what you would like to set. So if you're unsure, just keep it as is and get all the performance you can out of your engines. It's also up to you for your preference for initial climb performance. I'll select Climb 1. Next, we go to the takeoff page. Here we'll enter 5 degrees for flaps. We can also double-click the CG soft key, similar to the zero fuel weight one from before, and it will be automatically detected. Verify the computed V-speeds by clicking next to each one in turn. Now we can set our takeoff trim to match the computed value on the trim wheel located next to the throttle levers. Now that our V-speeds are calculated, we can set up the Mode Control Panel, or MCP. The first thing we'll do here is set V2 in our speed window. Next, we'll set runway heading in the heading window, followed by our initial climb altitude in the altitude window. Since we're not online and don't have any specific instructions from ATC, I'll set our transition altitude here. Now we'll turn on the flight directors by first flipping the captain's side FD on switch to on, thereby setting it as master, followed by the first officer side switch. Note that the indication for which flight director is the master is indicated by the green MA being illuminated above the respective switch. Next, we arm the auto throttle, as well as LNAV and VNAV. This is actually a matter of preference here. In real life, different operators have different procedures for takeoff. They may only arm LNAV here and manually bug up the speed setting before engaging VNAV after a certain point in the takeoff flow. For me, my hardware limits how comfortable this kind of process is. I fly with a joystick in my right hand, and I also use a mouse with my right hand. Fumbling around with trying to bug up during a critical phase of flight is something I try to avoid. But again, these are different procedures that can achieve the same results, so I encourage you to do what is most comfortable. Now we set the altimeter to the correct setting. If you don't have access to this information, you can always use the magic button. On PC, it's set to the B key as default. Ensure that the captain, first officer, and backup altimeter settings all match. Finally, for this departure, it's worthwhile to note that although it's a simple procedure, we have a navigational aid we should tune to on our radio to give us a helpful backup. Here we have the MOMI Mike India ADF, or Automatic Direction Finder, which we can tune to 364 on the ADF radio panel located toward the back left-hand side of the center pedestal. Once the correct frequency is set it to active. We are now finally ready for pushback and engine start. PMDG provides a bespoke pushback option that can be accessed in the FS Actions menu in the FMC. There's also the default pushback option, but I'll be using GSX for this demonstration. For this flight, given where we're parked, we want nose right, tail left. Also, make sure the chocks have been removed before you try to push back.
Release parking brakes, please.
Once we're cleared for engine start, we can turn on the fuel pumps, set our transponder to TA, and set the beacon, or anti-collision light, to on. We also, and this is very important, need to set the left and right pack switches to off. This ensures that our engines get the proper bleed air pressure in order to start properly. If you've made it to this point and can't seem to get N2 rotation, then you've most likely left your packs on. Now for engine start. When ready, turn the engine 2 start switch to ground and monitor the lower MFD display for rising N2. Continue monitoring until the indication is at 25%, at which point you can introduce fuel by lifting the number 2 fuel cutoff switch located behind the throttle levers. Continue monitoring for engine stabilization. You'll hear a click at some point during the start procedure. This is the starter valve. It's the starter switch flipping back to the off position. A good rule of thumb for a stable engine is the 2-4-6 rule. N1 is around 20%, EGT is approximately 400 degrees, and N2 is around 60%. Once this is achieved, repeat this process for engine 1.
Unlocking gear. Tow truck disconnected. 5 bypass pin removed. Left is clear, right is clear.
Now that both engines are successfully started, we need to set the Gen 1 and Gen 2 switches to on. We also need to set the left and right pack switches to auto, the isolation valve switch to auto, the APU bleed to off, and the APU start switch to off. Finally, we need to put the left and right probe heat switches in the on position. Now we set our takeoff flaps, flaps 5, checking for proper indication. And set the auto brake to RTO. Pressing the SYS button next to the auto brake switch brings up the flight control page. We check to make sure our elevator, aileron, and rudder control are all working. We can blank the lower display unit by pressing the SYS button once more. Lastly, we can now go ahead and turn on our taxi light and our runway turn-off lights. And that's it. We're now ready for taxi and have completed the full cold and dark startup procedure. I hope you've enjoyed this video and have found it helpful as well as informative. The PMDG 737 is a complicated aircraft, and every system we've interacted with throughout is well deserving of a dedicated video itself. There's always more to learn and also more to enjoy. I'll leave you here with a compulsory clip of me taking off. Thanks for watching. Take care.
Airspeed's alive.